we've been trying to tell better stories about women and clergy and the church because we really need to tell better stories. Instead of just complaining about it, what if we flood the airwaves with something different? I thought we'd talk about, first I want to talk about your January event that you kicked off and kind of what that was, how that came about, and what was the purpose of all of that. And then we'll talk about like your call and what you're doing now and how you got to that place.
Okay.
So the January event, which thanks for inviting me, it was great to be a part of that. And so you had 31 days, because there's 31 days in January, of women preaching online, so virtual preaching, lifting up women's voices, which I love, and it's what I'm trying to do with this podcast. I have men on the podcast also, but I'm trying to edify and curate women's voices is what I'm trying to do, so that we start telling better stories about women and their role in the kingdom and how we're making a difference. Especially because some days it doesn't feel like we're making a difference, right? Well, at least for me, sometimes it feels like I'm not. So just talk about, like, what was the purpose of that really? And then how did that come about? Like, what was the seeds that were...
So the purpose genuinely was to give women an opportunity to speak, because there's so many women who don't have the opportunity to speak. And how it genuinely came about was I have several online Facebook groups for different women of faith. And in one of them, I have a masterclass, which is like a closed paid group. And we were having this conversation about how to lean into your call and what that looks like. And one of the women had gotten excited about being an evangelist and going into revivalism. And so she came back into one of our group discussions and said that she had gone back to her leadership, who said, oh, well, revivalism is dead, so why bother? But she was still excited. And I was happy about that. She was like, but I'm still going to do it. And we were just sitting there thinking, okay, what should we do? And somebody said, well, why don't we just do something on Facebook? And I'm like, okay. And they're like, well, we could do like something every day in January. And I'm like, okay. Now, mind you, I had COVID at the time. So I'm laying on this mattress at my daughter's house, who had left for vacation. I'm laying there thinking, okay, can I do this? I've got nothing better to do with my time, right? And I thought, all right, if we do this and we just organize it every day in the month of January, we could start the year off with revival. And why not, right? And so I spent several days really contacting friends who I knew who were good speakers, other ministerial women. So there were marketplace ministers. So these are women who have, ministries that are business-based, but they're very forward in their faith. And then I just kind of, in 4 days, I created the group and had 30 speakers lined up for the entire month. And it was a fantastic way, actually, to start the year, which was already so tenuous with so much stuff that was going on in our culture, to really know that every day we could listen to a powerful message of a woman speaking specifically on holiness. And yeah, absolutely loved it.
Yeah, it was great. I got to watch many of them. I need to go back and watch the last few days. The end of the last week of January. We had some personal things happening, but I still have it on my to-do list to go back and watch those last few, because I want them all to be encouraged. I don't want to feel like, because we're at the end of the month, that they just got pushed to the side.
And some of the women several of them had over 1,000 views per person. And so I put it on a public group intentionally so it could be shared on or off of Facebook. So you didn't even have to be on Facebook to watch the videos. And so creating that platform, that was a public platform. And so some of the women, at the end, there was actually more people watching near the end, just because there had been more attention to the event itself.
Yeah. And you mentioned you have a YouTube channel. So did you put it on that?
I have not. I did curate the videos, but I have not repurposed them just yet.
Okay. And it is tricky. I haven't quite figured out how to pull some stuff you can pull off and some stuff you can't. I don't. understand that on the Facebook side, but so make sure you let me know what your YouTube channel is, because I want to make sure people can jump on there and share it. I'm sure you have some good stuff on there.
I recently found out that if you Google Pastor Elaine Imposter Syndrome YouTube, that my video will be the first thing that pops up on Google. And I'm like, yes. So if you want to cure your imposter syndrome, Pastor Elaine YouTube. And then you'll find my channel.
I want to come back to that. So I'm making a note. I want to come back to that imposter syndrome thing, because that's important. So you've curated this, and you had a good response to it.
Very much so.
And I know that this came out of your master class that you're doing, right? I'm doing a mastermind group too for people who want to start dinner church, which I started in the fall. And so talk about how you got to that place, because that's your primary ministry right now, right? Your primary ministry is doing mastermind groups, master class. So you're doing a lot of training and curating. What's the heart of your ministry? Like, do you have a name, or are you just Elaine Ministry, Pastor Elaine Ministry? What's your name? And then
so the business name is Fishing, the number 4 Truth, Fishing for Truth. And because I'm an avid fisherwoman, and I love fishing, I really intend someday to be a Christian Dr. Phil for my bass boat. So that's my long-term goal. And so goodness, if you think about, if we go all the way back to my call and being raised in the church, and I was adopted at birth by these people who took me to church all the time, but I was sexually abused by them. And so my view of church was skewed. And so I was watching your talk that was in that group about how you had that moment. Why didn't anybody tell you that Jesus was God in the flesh, right? I had that same moment when I got saved. Why didn't anybody tell me that this was supposed to be a personal relationship? It was just all ritual. And so that day came when I got saved, and I'm like, wow, why have I been here for 22 years and nobody told me that this was supposed to be different than what it was? And I went on this mission of how do we do church better? And here's this knowledge about this forgiveness and this new life and this renewed sense of self that I gained from this relationship with God. And I thought, why am I not sharing? Why doesn't everybody share it? I mean, I was like totally on fire. But the messages that I got immediately thereafter, and I think they were unintentional, but the day after I got saved, I said, hey, I think I want to go to be a missionary, because I genuinely believed that if I was in a different country, I wouldn't be as tempted by the sin that I had in my life. Now I know that's not true. However, in the moment, I thought, I should be a missionary. And my pastor, who's the one who led me to Christ the day before, looked at me and said, don't sell your house. Everybody says that, and turned around and walked away. And I genuinely had no clue what he even meant by that. I just I walked away, and it was like a long time before I understood what he even meant. And nobody really talked to me about my desire to go into ministry. And so a lot of life happened after that. I had a lot of mental health issues because of the way I was raised and all the things that I'd gone through. And so I went to in and out of mental health issues. I had a lot of acting out as a young woman, and then ended up divorced and figured I'm never going to go to the ministry. Just not going to happen. So because of all of my mental health help that I had received in an era where that was poo-pooed by the church, you're not supposed to go to counseling in that era. And I learned so much. I'm like, wow, if I could take some of this knowledge back into the church and educate people on just some basics of mental health stuff, that I would be doing something to help further the kingdom. Right. So I went through 11 years of college, plus all the extraneous training that you didn't need to take in the state of California to become licensed as a therapist. And at the end of that time, some of the regulations had changed for ordination. So I was able to go back and finish or start and finish the requirements for ordination. And so by the time I graduated, I had both. And really going into how do I now vest into the kingdom in a way that's practical. But because I was so highly valued as a therapist, I kind of got cubbyholed in that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it was definitely important and needed, but I never got to go and minister spiritually to people which was like my main drive, right? Is to help people. I used to tell people my goal is to take as many hands of people in the hands of God, in the hand of God, and join them together over and over and over again as often as I can until the day I die. And I felt like I was stuck doing therapy. Now, therapy is valuable. I don't want anybody listening to this to say that it's not, or to misunderstand that. But my heart's passion was really on the spiritual realm. And so as the years went by, I ended up being in a very large church, being the director of the counseling ministry, and had like all these interns from colleges working underneath me, all this kind of stuff, and helping lots and lots of people. And so I still just last week got a call from somebody from that town, and I'm not even in the same state anymore, saying that somebody referred them to me for counseling. And I had to tell them, I'm sorry, I don't do that anymore. And so, I ended up, through a change of circumstances, being in a smaller church and in a very rural town. And I was on the top of this hill where I used to go to worship, and made a little video, and it probably was 12 minutes long, maybe, just about some insights that God showed me while I was sitting up there. Posted on Facebook and kind of shared it around a little bit, and it had over 1,200 views. And I thought, you know, I could do so much more with what's already available to me, and spread a message. If I actually put my energy into that rather than into this small church that I was at, the associate pastor, realizing that I really wasn't going to be able to go into a senior leadership role in the dynamic that was happening at the time. And so I actually resigned my position. It was probably the hardest thing I've ever done, because I love the church. I love people. I love serving communion. I love praying over people. I love laying hands on people. I love ministering. And the verse where King David talks about, you know, being in the presence of God. I mean, I can't pull it up at the moment, but just being in the presence of the God in his temple is like the desire of his heart. And every time I heard that, it would just like make my heart grieve that I'm going to give this away. But I knew that the calling was greater, that what I was called to do was so necessary to spread on a different level, that I resigned that position and actually applied to do special service. So I'm still under the umbrella of my denomination, but I operate as special service specifically for clergy women, interdenominationally. And so they gifted me with that, but I was kind of on my own on how to make that happen. And so I took some of the education that I had done in the local church and created an online program, because God revealed to me that identity and how our identities can genuinely be abused. That if you have an identity, it can be abused and you not even be aware of it by somebody saying something, or a trauma that you've experienced, or even watching bad television programs or whatever. And God revealed to me how damaging identity abuse was. And so I created a program called Identity Abuse Busters, and used that then to create a coaching program, and started that to morph out of counseling, formal counseling, into something specific that's going to help people recover from this really chronic low self-esteem that seemed to give them an inability to receive what God had gifted to us. The truth was not, they couldn't receive truth. And so out of that, really looking at who can I minister to the most, and understanding that I'm supposed to be working with clergy women. It was challenging because a lot of clergy women are still in that role of pursuing a specific position.
Yeah.
Being able to say, I can help you expand that and look at options for you. It was very challenging. It's still challenging to a certain extent. And so I decided to bring into my groups entrepreneurial Christian women. So these are women who own their own businesses, who are very strong Christians and have an amazing testimony. And I mingle them together, which give both sides a benefit. And so I created multiple groups on different various levels in order to be able to do that qualitatively. So
Right. Yeah. So you basically curate safe space, don't you?
yes, that's my goal. And it's a safe space, but it's also a space of hope and anticipation. Where it's a safe place for you to be who you are called to be and to express that, but then also to find that mentorship and hope that you can fulfill that, and to give you the guidance on how to do that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You can, you know, if you don't, and you, well, you would know this out of coming out of your background and your experience of your childhood, that therapy gave you that safe space to not just heal, but then also to grow so that you can move beyond that and be everything that God desired for you to become, right? That He created you to be. That idea of identity abuse, I think, is so powerful. There is an element of, you know, I've referred to it often as spiritual abuse, where we take our power that we have in Christ and we use it for ungodly purposes, you know, to control or manipulate others. And I think identity abuse maybe takes it one step further, because there is a sense of where our identity in Christ becomes skewed because we abuse that power that we've been given by God. You know, and it just happens that I'm going to be preaching in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 this week. So, you know, the gifts of the Spirit. And of course, everything I've ever read, and any sermons I've ever read or heard or Bible studies on that chapter, they're always talking about the gifts, the gifts, the gifts. And nobody talks about that, those first couple verses where it says, you know, you serve mute idols. And then of course the implication in that second verse is, but God, our God is not mute. And one of the ways that He speaks is through each and every one of us. And He speaks through these gifts. And so when we abuse those gifts, we are corrupting and corroding the voice of God here, you know, in this world. So maybe talk about, so you talked about, I want to keep going there for a minute, and then I want to go back to your call, but talk about the kinds of things that you do in your masterclass to help people with identity abuse. I'm guessing you use some of your skills as a therapist, a licensed therapist, and you still have did you keep your license? Did you keep it up to date?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So some of the things that you use, like practical things for people to begin walking in that newness of their identity in Christ.
Well, thanks for asking that. It's because it is so valuable for people to really understand there is a way to recover from that. And I think primarily looking at two things. What is it that you genuinely believe about yourself? And then what is it that you genuinely believe about the character of God? And so I often will ask people, what is the worst thing that you think about yourself? And when is the first time you ever remember thinking that about yourself? And that is the time where there was a message instilled in you that most likely did not come from God. And if your view of God is not healthy, you're going to believe inappropriate, incorrect things about God. So the challenge really is going back and saying, do I choose to believe what is true, or do I choose to believe what feels true? And so oftentimes these messages that we got as a youngster they feel true because we've had them for so many years. I feel inadequate. I feel unlovable. I feel rejected. I feel, you know, and it's a feeling. So anytime that something comes along that correlates with that feeling, we tend to agree with it. And if somebody comes along and say, oh, I love you, you'll have a tendency to reject that because you don't believe it, because it doesn't feel true. So the vast majority of my time is really helping people understand that they have a choice in the matter, and it's very academic in that regard. And it's not dismissing how you feel, but it's understanding that my feelings should not predict or dictate my behavior or my relationship with God.
Right. And I'm assuming I'm gonna make an assumption in the statement that I'm gonna say, but that our feelings are not insignificant, though. Our feelings do identify something that's happening and should point us towards the. I happen to be listening to. Do you ever listen to Allison Cook? No. Oh man, I have to look and see what her name is. But she's a counselor also, and she happens to have an Instagram. And so occasionally I'll watch her little things. Anyway, she was recently talking about this idea of our feelings acting as a trailhead. And so that when this feeling comes up, that should be the thing that we say, okay, where's this coming from? Why is this here? And helping us to move down the trail towards healing and reconciliation. So I guess I'm saying, would you talk a little bit about that, about how we can, instead of being hijacked by our feelings, but we can use them to help us in that, like connecting the two, basically.
So the thing that I try to get all my coaching clients to understand and repeat often is emotional maturity is the ability to tolerate uncomfortable emotions. So can we get to the place where we have an uncomfortable emotion and we sit with it and we don't respond to it? Can we allow ourselves to experience the moment and say, wow, this is really, and label it, this is really sad, or that makes me really mad, or that makes me very, and label it. And then say, so now that I'm feeling this way, what do I want to do with it? I don't have to respond to it right now instantaneously. I can decide what I'm going to do about it. And that's the one thing that people have the hardest time with, that, well, those that come to me for, that type of coaching is really that emotional immaturity, which actually rolls over then into spiritual immaturity, because we're reacting on our feelings rather than what is fact in the moment. And so, yeah, our feelings are extremely important. They're giving us very much a clear information about something that's happening in front of us. But if we do not take the time to recognize how my body is feeling in the moment when that particular instance happens, and then why is that happening, and then what I want to do about it.
Right. Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, I have lots of thoughts about there's such a need for resources like that out there.
Exactly.
For so many of us. We had a friend of ours 4 years ago who he'd come into the church, he was part of our congregation. And it was one of these where a friend of ours brought him to church, like trying to get him. So we became friends, and it would have been like actually 6 years ago, and we befriended him. And I mean, he was one of these people where I just use this phrase that the universe conspired against him, and I don't actually, believe that, right? I mean, I believe that God is in control and we have free will, but it's like the only phrase I can use that really kind of defines, like, from the moment he was born, like he was brought home from the hospital, and his mom literally handed him over the fence to the next door neighbor, and then just left and abandoned him. And so it was just like, that was like the start of just one after another, and abuse, and which eventually led to alcohol, and then drug abuse, and then being in and out of prison, and probably had severe mental illness also. It is because as a result of many of these things. And so we had befriended him, really taken him in, and he was responding like, we just kept loving him and telling him we love him, and having him for dinner and those kind of things. And I remember, like, one of the last times we talked to him, we were trying to share about God's love without saying, here, pray this prayer, and like, kind of in his face. And like the anxiety, like, in his body, he couldn't handle it. Like, he had never experienced people loving him for just him being him, that he almost like got up and ran out the door. Like, that was his body language. And a couple of days later, we ended up getting a call from the police, and they said, your friend is here. He got, he was arrested shoplifting a steak and some Fix-A-Flat. He said maybe you'd bail him out. So, we went and picked him up, and of course he was drunk or stoned or both. I don't know which. And we took him for dinner, and it was almost as if being loved was so painful that the only thing he knew was to do something that would hopefully disrupt and break that tension so we wouldn't love him anymore. And, so he ended up in jail, and we would go and see him and stuff. And he'd sit there and cry and say, I've been in jail before, and nobody has ever visited me in jail. And he just didn't know what to do with it. He couldn't figure it out. It was so foreign to him. He ended up, so then 4 years ago, he ended up overdosing, and he was found in a hotel in a weird situation. Like he lived at that hotel, but he was in somebody else's room. He was wrapped up in a blanket. All of his belongings were gone. But because he had a history, they weren't going to investigate. And I just remember being left with this sense of, like, he is a classic victim of identity abuse that I feel like we need more resources to really be able to help. And we probably did everything. We did everything that we knew to do, right? Which was to just love him. But I feel like there should be more resources for pastors, but also just for Christians in general, for us to help one another.
I think that there's a lot of truth in that. And people have asked me, if I do pastoral training on the identity abuse concept. And so it is, because it is like when I do it one-on-one with coaching, it's a 6-month program to take people from, I can't believe this about myself, or I had this emotional reactivity, to take them individually through that process. It takes some time. And so what I built inside the masterclass was all of those lessons and the videos, so that the women can go through at their own time while I go in there, and they can ask me any questions as well. But it is, one of the things that I wanted to respond to his story, which is tragic on so many levels, is that what he was experiencing was that if I have to receive this love from you, that all of this old pain is just going to come flooding out. And men especially will run from that because they're not sure how do I handle this? How do I handle this deep feeling of profound love? And I'm just going to cry, and that's uncool. And I can't do this. And it's too risky. And all these internal messages that they're probably not even aware of. They're just very subconscious because of the history that they've experienced. The messages of rejection, the messages of impossibility of being loved at that level. And so they will, in order to keep people from loving them, they'll go do something because I can't feel those feelings. They're too big and they're too much. And I think that if we can understand what's happening inside of them during those moments, it would actually help them better.
Right. Yeah. Well, I was pretty sure that that was the response, like that he was responding out of that, but I just had no idea what. I mean, we took him for dinner. That was what we, and then we kept, we'd leave bags of groceries at his door. He knew it was us, but we didn't, we did a drop and run, so he didn't feel odd. And we tried to give him things to do when he would come on Sundays that, when we have a potluck, and he'd help us set up and clean up and stuff like that. So he felt like he was contributing, not a charity case. But it was, yeah.
Yeah, it is really challenging. So if you think about the emotional trauma, the emotional trauma of the rejection is huge. So the message of rejection, and then you're telling them, well, God loves you. And you're like, well, how the message is that how can somebody who's so perfect love somebody like me, whose parents can't even love me, who we're supposed to? So the message is so deep and profound that it's hard for them to accept.
Yeah. Oh man, this is just all so good. I'm like, we could go on with this forever. I guess I want to talk a little bit more about your call. I know you came to faith in Christ around the age of 22. So maybe share a little bit about this revelation, and then how of who Jesus was, you know, and giving yourself over to him. And then how did you end up navigating that years later? Okay, I am going to receive this call. I'm going to accept this call that's on my life. Can you maybe just go maybe a little more detail? I feel like there are women out there who really, and of course I would have that same, you know, that would have been my experience where initially I'm like, oh, I'm supposed to do this. And of course I didn't have the language to articulate it. And so came back to it later on down the road. And so I just think it's important for women, but even men, to hear that, especially when you come out of an abusive situation, because there's so much that needs to happen before you're even really able to hear that call. So I don't know, talk a little bit more about that, please.
Yeah, I typically start off by introducing myself with my childhood story about when my mom called me into the living room one day, and I was about 8 years old. And my parents literally I grew up in an era where you're to be seen and not heard. And they legitimately took that at face value. So my parents did not talk to me for any reason unless there was a chore to do or I was in trouble for something. And so I assumed as I go down to the hallway to go meet my mom that I'm in trouble for something. And she looks down at me and she says, "Your brother tells me that your dad's been touching you. Is that true?" And I'm like, yeah. And she looks at my dad, who's sitting on the couch behind her, behind the newspaper, and says, "Is that true?" And he doesn't ever look from the newspaper. He doesn't twitch. He goes, "I don't know what she's talking about." So we have this kind of weird conversation, and every time she brings him into the conversation, he never twitches and just says, "I don't know what she's talking about." And then the conversation ended. So I go back to my room, and what I realized, because of my dad's line, it's important for people to understand it's the lie. The lie that he told was more damaging than all the other things that he did to me, because he negated the reality of my message and my voice. And so I learned how to just be who anybody else wanted me to be. So it didn't matter which environment I was in. I learned to just be what anybody else wanted. And so I didn't matter. My voice didn't matter. And when I had something important to say, nothing was going to happen. And so I learned that my value was based on what I could do for other people. And so I learned how to manipulate men. I learned how to manipulate people in general. I ended up getting involved in drugs and promiscuity and the whole 9 yards. And so then I tell people, you know, about my ministry and all that kind of stuff. However, jumping to the end of this particular story, when I was 22, the police showed up at my door and they're asking me about this situation with my dad. And for the first time in my life, I told somebody the truth about what was happening to me. And thankfully, my dad did go to jail. It was shortly after that, and my parents were so involved in the church and they were so good. They were such professional hypocrites that my dad went to jail during the week and got to come home on the weekends and still went to church. And so I had to go tell the pastor, "By the way, did you know he got convicted? He's just coming home on the weekends and going to church like nothing ever happened." And so we were attending the same church at that time. So a lot of dysfunction on multiple levels. And during that time that my dad went to jail, I went to that same pastor and I said, "Hey, so I think I need counseling." And he's like, "Well, what do you want to get out of it?" And I'm like, "I don't know." He says, "Make a list." So I went home and I made a little list of 10 things that I wanted to get out of it. And they had things like better relationships with my parents, better relationship with my brothers. I had 2 brothers and we were all adopted from different families. We were like the Three Stooges. It was really hilarious. And so I went back and he says, "Well, where do you want to start on the list?" And I said, "My relationship with God." Now, 100% honest, I had no inclination whatsoever to discuss my spiritual condition with my pastor. There was no thought that I needed to have any conversation about it, and God was not on the list. And he asked me, he says, "Where is your relationship with God?" And I did not know how to answer the question. I just said, "I don't know." I didn't even know what that meant. Now, right. I was 22 years old. I was raised in church every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, every Wednesday night, VBS, the whole 9 yards. My dad's on the church board, teaches the junior high Sunday school class. Mom plays the organ, all there all the time. And here I was, 22 years old, couldn't answer the question. And he says, well, did you ever ask Jesus into your heart? And I said, well, when I was 5 at VBS, my brother made me go down to the altar, and I cried because he didn't want to go. And the guy that came to pray with me got mad because I wouldn't stop crying. And then my pastor goes, is that it? And I'm like, yeah. And he says, well, we can fix that. And I'm like, okay. So we're talking, it's a very bizarre conversation, right? I'm going in there with all this other stuff going on in my life. And I'm asking him, I need to work on my relationship with God. I don't even know what that means, right? So we go into the sanctuary. We got out of his office, down in the sanctuary, prayed at the altar, simple sinner's prayer. And so the next day was the day I went to him and said, hey, I think I want to be a missionary. He told me that night, he said, go tell 3 people what happened, and which I did. And the following Sunday, we're in church, and I'm reading, I'm singing the hymns. And for the first time in my life, I realized they're about me. I'm like, oh, wow, these songs are like about me and my relationship. And it was like I woke up, like I genuinely woke up. And I'm like, how come nobody told me? So I had that same thought that you have. Why didn't anybody tell me? And I had all these questions, and people would get mad. I had this one pastor's wife. I said, your husband said something like this morning. And I remember exactly, we were in the parking lot on Wednesday night. I remember exactly where I was at, or Sunday night. And I said, your husband said thus and so, and she turned around and she said, if you don't like the way my husband preaches, you can go find another church. And I'm like, oh, so I learned, don't ask questions. I learned, and I'm just like absorbing all this stuff and reading all these things and trying so hard to like grasp, why are we doing church the way we're doing it? And I even asked, why aren't we doing house churches when in the New Testament at time? I had all these questions, and people were just, and I was genuinely just wanting to know. Right. And so as time went by, I ended up having some issues with church leaders that replicated the issues that I had with my dad, which profoundly impacted my mental health issues. And I ended up hospitalized 5 times in 1 year for depression. So I went completely off the rails by the time I was 30. And really, it was just horrible. I'm sure anybody can imagine that if you're hospitalized for mental depression in a mental hospital that many times, it was just horrible. And I realized that my personal situation, my marital situation was just extremely toxic. And I left the marriage, took the kids with me. So I was a stay-at-home mom for 11 years, trying to be the good Christian mom, trying to go to church and do the thing and do the, and it was just so unhealthy. And I left and decided that I needed to do something because I couldn't support, 4 kids by myself. And then went into the education system for the first time. And so here I was 31 years old, starting college, and completed that 11 years later with my master's degree in psychology. And during that time, I actually walked away from God. I had a situation with one of the pastors at the church, and I was doing some things that I probably shouldn't have been. and he called me on it, and he made some derogatory statements, and I just walked away. I said, I don't need this. I'm not going to hell. I just don't need this. And I had a friend who was my mentor when I first became a Christian, who kept saying, when are you going to come back to church? When are you going to come back to church? When are you going to come back to church? And so years later, I would always take my kids to church functions. And then when we moved into another metropolitan area, I went to this one particular church where there was a good youth pastor for my kids. And my friend was there, and she'd say, when are you going to go to church? When are you going to go back into the ministry? When are you going to start preaching? And just over and over and over again. And I'm like, why do you keep doing this to me? Why? Church is happening. God doesn't need me. I've even had people since then tell me, God doesn't need you. He can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. It's like, and then I just realized I was 42, and I can't recall exactly what it was. All I know is that there was this moment in time where I said, all right, I need to give into what I know I need to be doing. And I joined the church and got my local license, I think like in the same month or something like that. And I just dove in, and I said, I can run from it. But I don't even know. I get so emotional about it. I want to do well what I know matters. And if there was one thing that saved me, even during all those years of mental illness, there was a nurse. I was like mentally checked out at one point, like legitimately, and life's a whole nother story, but legitimately like checked out. And she asked me one time, because this is like the third time I was in, and she said, "I thought you were called to ministry." And I said, "Yeah." And she goes, "How come we never talk about it?" And I said, "Because I don't believe on imposing my beliefs on other people." And she goes, "That's okay here." And I said, "Really?" She goes, "Yeah." And I kid you not, I woke up. I like woke up at that moment, and I realized, I'm called. I mean, I can't even explain it. I went from this totally mentally checked out person to being awake and alive again to this call of God on my life, that God had something for me, that my value in him was so deep, so profound. And being able to lean in that, receive that, and own that. I still had a lot of struggles to go through before I actually left the marriage, and then went on this trajectory of being able to be in a helping profession, and then leaning into my call, wholly leaning into my call. And I had a leader, one of my leaders, in an event that I was at, who turned to the congregation and he said, "You have so-and-so who's really great, da, da, da," and looked at me and said, "And there's Pastor Elaine, who is just durable." And I thought, well, I don't know. At first I thought, is that really all you can say about me? But I thought, you know what? I am so committed. I am so committed to the cause of Christ, to the message of reconciliation to God, to the healing power, the death of the enemy's power in your life. I mean, that because I've seen it in my own life, watched it happen, and I've watched it happen with other people, that I'm not, it's not like I owe it to God because he's, I owe him something, but it's like he's gifted me, and I would be remiss to not share it with other people, to knowing the power and the depth of resurrection that can happen in somebody's life if the truth is made plain to them. And that's why I try to do all that I do to genuinely break it down into I'm a practical theologian till the cows come home. I want you to be able to apply everything that I tell you. And so that's about all I should probably say about that.
Oh, I think that's good stuff. All right, I want to come back to, because I made myself a note, and now I'm not going to forget it. I want to come back to imposter syndrome, because you said you have. That's kind of how this got. Is that kind of how it got started? Your video series with on the imposter syndrome, or is that just one element of it?
That's just one element of it. Yeah.
Okay, so talk a little bit about imposter syndrome, because I've heard a few different definitions, and not that yours is necessarily going to solve it all, but throw yours in the hat with everybody else. So just talk about imposter syndrome, what it is, and how we can, maybe one practical step we can take to begin overcoming that.
And so the basic core of imposter syndrome is believing that you're a fraud, that someone's going to find out that you're not who you say you are. And the reality is that it comes out of comparison. I'm comparing myself to somebody else that I believe should be doing this instead of me. And what I help people do is understand that you have something to share with the world. There's something specific that you have, and you just share it. And if you can just focus on, I'm this vessel of information and experience and knowledge, and I'm going to just share it with people, then you can get out of who am I to share this? Well, you've had your own experience. This is coming out of your own experience. And so therefore you can't be an imposter because it's true about you. And if you say, well, it's mostly a comparison about a role or a position, and it's really a lie. It's purely a lie. To be able to say, what is that phrase? What is that thing that you're afraid that people are going to find out about you that's going to make you unworthy of sharing this message? And really looking at why shouldn't you? What are they going to say? What are you afraid they're going to find out? And oftentimes they can't even answer that question, because it's all in the self. It's all a self-comparison issue. And So did that make sense?
Yes. I have myself muted. I'm like, I am going to just get myself one of those shirts that says you're on mute. Which I said to someone, well, I said to my coach the other day, I said, I'm sure there are lots of people who wish I was on mute in real life, but she's like, well, maybe we should talk about that statement. I'm like, well, tomorrow, later, next time. So look.
That's okay.
No,
I've been doing the same thing, muting off and on, off on. Yeah.
No, I have. Yeah, no, I haven't. My mic's not too sensitive, so maybe it's not picking it up. But so I guess I want to talk about what a couple of things. Advice for people who advice for women who are pursuing a call, or I don't even want to necessarily limit it to women, but probably will be focusing on them. But women or men who are sensing a call to ministry, who know they have abuse in their background, or some significant spiritual abuse in their background. So just advice on accepting the call, and then also steps that they might have to take. I mean, there was lots of baggage that I had to deal with before I came into ministry, and maybe and that you're really kind of always dealing with. You're always processing it and refining it, and so just words of advice that you might give to those people, those persons who find themselves in that category. I guess I don't want to label them, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think that I was thinking about this earlier, that a lot of men that are in ministry also struggle with this thought of, I'm not good enough, I'm not valuable enough. They're isolated, and I was surprised the more that I talked to people one-on-one, how frequently they feel that way, in that sense of isolation, and am I really capable of doing this? And so what I try to help people do is focus on, what are you called to do specifically? So my call is to revivalism. So when I look back at all of the history of everything that I've experienced, it's, I want to help the church survive my era. And I want them to be effective if they survive. And so I know that that's what my call is. So if you identify specifically your call, and I put this questionnaire one time inside of a group and said, what are you called to do? And they'll say, pastor. And I'm like, okay, what does that mean to you? Well, be in charge of a church. Well, but what does that mean to you on a given day? What does it mean to pastor a people? And to be super practical about that, super specific. And so if you're called to teach or lead or pray, or what are the behaviors? Because you can do that even if you have, I need to be careful about this, but even if you have mental issues and emotional issues, you can pray for people. Right? You can tell people your story. You can witness, you can disciple, you can say, I'll read my Bible with you. There are behaviors that you can do even as you're healing. And it's important to really understand that you have to take responsibility for your own healing. Absolutely. If you know that you have issues, and if somebody else has told you that you have issues, it would behoove you to go and just have that researched a little bit. But to know that you can still do what you're called to do. And this is like so important. I mean, I had this conversation, we had like 11 women on this morning, just really talking about what is it that you're called to do specifically, and then go do that thing. So if you're called to preach, go find some place to preach. You can do it online. You can do it at your homeless shelter. There's so many places that you can preach. And look at what you're called to do. And then, when it comes to your mental health issues, I try really hard to separate these things out. What's your mind? So you have mental health and emotional health and spiritual health. So mental is actually a misnomer. When they talk about mental health is, can you actually add 2 + 2? Is your thinking appropriate? Can you actually think in a way like every other brain on average thinks? And then there's your emotional health. Do you feel and respond to feelings the same way as people on average do? And then there's spiritual, which is my relationship with God. Now, your mental health and your spiritual health should not dictate your relationship with God. This is how much are you actually in line with God and having a relationship with him and growing with him. Really understand the variations between those. It will help you know where to get the help that you need. If you have emotional issues, then, you know, you go find help for those emotional issues. And so I don't want to say that you should be able to go into formal ministry at a higher leadership level where you're responsible for lots and lots and lots of people and not taking responsibility for your emotional health. That's not what I'm saying. You definitely need to separate those out and see where you need to find that support and encouragement. And then there's leadership skills. So then there's a skill set. So I tell people you need to have mindset, heart posture, skill set. So your mindset is, are you thinking clearly about who you are, what you're doing, who God is, all that kind of mindset? You know, what do you really genuinely believe? And then heart posture is your relationship with God. How is your relationship with God? What are you doing to maintain that? And then skill set is the skills that you need to be able to do your ministry well. And those are the three areas that I break things down. The one area too that I wanted to drop in there before I changed the subject is the spiritual warfare issue. We do not cover that topic at all well enough to help people understand when the enemy is playing with someone, and they'll own it for themselves. They'll say, you know, I'm bad, I can't, my thinking is wrong. They'll beat themselves up and not recognize that the enemy is the one that's doing it. And I wish that we'd have more expansive conversations on that as well.
Yeah, that would be an interesting, and we can go there if you want to take a couple minutes to do that. Because I feel like, and I'll even just say for myself, that I have been, most of the time I live on one end of the spectrum or the other in regards to spiritual warfare. So there are times when I am like, yes, this is a real thing, and et cetera, et cetera. And then there are other times where I'm like, oh my, like cynical towards it. And there hasn't been, especially in my denomination, which I think we're the same denomination, right? Yeah. There hasn't seemed to be a healthy middle ground of that. So I guess, how can we help people find that balance and recognize when is this a spiritual warfare issue and when is this, well, I'm going to use two different phrases. There's brokenness and woundedness. So I think that we can be in a place that's broken, that's years and multiple wounds, right? And then we can be wounded where we're in a situation we've recently been wounded by something or whatever, and we're processing it, we're trying to heal. So how can we better distinguish between when is it spiritual and when is it spiritual warfare, I should say specifically, and when is it, man, if I could find a coach, a therapist, a friend to have coffee with to process this pain?
Well, yeah, so there's, it's really understanding the spiritual realm. And that was one of the things that I didn't do. I didn't even know how to do until I had a family member who was actually manifesting right in front of me. And I'm like, I'm a pastor. Why don't I know what to do about this? And really saying, okay, if I believe in God, if I believe that I'm a spiritual being, if I believe Jesus rose from the dead and he's alive today, I really need to believe in the enemy to the same capacity with which I believe these other things, because it's evident to me now, it's real. And having that conversation, just even on a basic level, is so valuable, because we're bringing to the forefront the reality that our battle is not against flesh and blood. We say these things, but do we believe them when it comes to living out our faith? And so the three things that I have that I coach on is that your identity is eternally valuable. Your uniqueness is eternally valuable and intentional. So that's the number one. That's the thing you have to believe, that God designed you uniquely. The second is the enemy is lying all the time. And to recognize that when you turn your TV on, I have to just turn your TV on and say, how many times will the enemy lie to you within a 15-minute time span? And what is the world trying to teach you? And and recognize that the enemy will manipulate all sorts of stuff, but he always uses emotion. And to recognize that when I'm tempted to do something, there's an emotional draw to that. There's always an emotional draw to that. And when we recognize that the enemy does that, we'll have a better clarity of what's happening in the moment. But not having the conversation, we're always going to say, I have a problem, or I'm giving in, or I'm, but we have to look and, what is the enemy doing in the moment? And then the third thing is you get to choose. You get to choose whether you're believing truth or you're believing your emotions, right? And so those are the three things that I cover all the time. And so the enemy factor is so valuable to say the enemy does work. He's a thought caster, so he puts thoughts in your mind, and we can either grab onto them or reject them. And just as Jesus said to a good friend, "Get behind me, Satan," looked him in the eye and just called it for what it is. And we don't, the fear of getting too, as they say, woo-woo-ish, we're going to fall off the bridge and become fanatical if we talk about things that are demonic. And that has kept me from being able to know what I needed to know to help my family member in that moment. So I went down to the woo-woo church, knocked on the door and said, all right, I need to know things because I have nothing. And I contacted the people in my denomination and just knocked on all sorts of doors and made all sorts of calls, and nobody could help me. And I was extremely disappointed in that. It took several months before I was able to connect with somebody who referred me to somebody in Israel, right? And but I went to that little church down the way, and he gave me 18 hours of a spiritual warfare conference, and I sat and in 3 days watched all 18 hours because I thought I need to know what's going on and I need to educate myself. And it was one of those things I avoided. I avoided it because they're the weird church, right? This is a weird conversation, and I don't really need to know all this. But then I realized that I did, and I went on Facebook and apologized for anybody who had ever come to me with a spiritual issue prior to that, and I did not have the knowledge on how to help them.
And so there's something that you said, which I think this is great. So this is not antagonistic. I'm trying to think of, I imagine there are people who, even in your situation, right, who your parents were, your dad was on the board, who would look back and say, oh, well, that was spiritual warfare trying to bring down the church. So how do we identify it, when there's spiritual warfare? How do we, like, my concern is finding that place where we don't justify like what happened to you or others by covering it in this language of spiritual warfare, but then also at the same time, we don't want to negate spiritual warfare.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. The difference for me is there's cause and then there's excuse. Right. So I can say beyond the shadow of a doubt that the enemy had a hold of my dad. No doubt about it. That might be the cause, and a lot of his choices, and we believe that he was molested as a child, and just the generational all garbage, right? So that does not excuse it. So we need to be able to clearly talk about the cause without talking about excuse, and that's an emotionally hard place for a lot of people to walk, to be able to say, because I've asked people, do you understand how this could occur? And they'll go, no, I can't understand that. And because they were afraid that if they understand it, that means that they approve. And so the delineation for me is the difference between accepting this genuinely happening and then approving of it. So we can accept this happened, but we don't have to necessarily approve that it happened. And so when we talk about spiritual warfare, we can say this is happening. That doesn't mean that we accept it as to be right and good and normal and minimize the impact. And so, yeah, it's definitely the way that we talk about it.
Oh, I think that is so key. So I really appreciate you just hanging in there with me as we move through that, because I think it's so key. There will be, a lot of people who will listen, who will, who have been wounded by the church or people within, within the body, have been wounded. And oftentimes the leadership, when they went to, because I have people sitting in my pews who they went to leadership and they were told that, well, it was their fault, or, they were, you know, all of those things that we've all heard those, you know, disheartening, ignorant statements in the sense of not knowing, you know, being uneducated and not knowing how to properly respond to those things. And so I think it's important that we just make some clarifications in that area. So I appreciate you doing that, because man, there's just so many de-churched people that we're ministering to in our community, our broader community, you know, beyond our faith community. And that's oftentimes what they will tell me. I won't come back because of, like, just even to walk through the doors, they begin to have an anxiety attack. And so I think it is important for us, which we could also even say, right, some of the anxiety is the enemy keeping them from coming back and being enfolded back into the body. But at the same time, we don't want to say, like, we get it, like right, like, I get it. Do you want to?
I did that one time. I had an altar call, and I have this prayer of deliverance, which I'll send to you so that you can actually attach it, hopefully somehow, to this. That I pray over most of the time when I preach. I'll pray this prayer of deliverance, and it's really talking about poking the enemy in the eye and then just receiving what God says is true. And in this particular sermon I did, I put them down on the altar, all the way across the altar, and I said, you know, the only thing that's keeping you from being able to get from your seat to this altar is the enemy. He's going to tell you, what are your kids going to say? What is the pastor going to think? What are the people in the church going to think? If your situation isn't that bad, you can get over it by yourself. He's going to continually sit here right now and tell you all of these messages to keep you from coming here and giving away the things that are keeping you from being all that God has designed you to be. And I said, and so you get to decide right now who's going to win that battle. And I closed my eyes and prayed. And the altar was just flooded with people, because they realized that they had the power over the enemy's lies to be able to live out what God was calling them to do, and to take action for themselves. And it again was just another testimony to that we need to have that conversation and really elevate the reality of the way the enemy is playing out havoc in our churches and in just people's lives in general.
Yeah. That's so good. This is also good. I just want to be like, can I just clone you? We just need healing. You know, we need healing in the church. And, you know, if we could have 10 more, you know, that grain of sand, so to speak, in your shoe, that, you know, if you don't get it out, eventually will wear a hole in your sock. So maybe if we just have, you know, a few more who are willing to say, here's the problem, and here's a way that we can move forward. Little by little, we reclaim ground that the enemy has stolen from us. Yeah. Little by little. Thank you.
And that's why I wrote a book, and I tell people, I took all these things that I would say to people over and over again. So people would come to me for therapy, and I would be saying the same thing to this couple and the same thing to this couple, same thing to this, you know. I thought, what if I just took all of that and put it in a book? Because a lot of the books that you go for self-help, they're like, you have one book all about codependency, or one book all about alcoholism, or one book about, you know, whatever. And I thought, what if I take it all and just cram it all in one book? And I've always been accused of over-delivering, but that's okay. And so I turned it into a journal style book. And so I took these quips that I say all the time and then explained them, and then asked a question specifically for your situation today. So every segment, which is like 2 to 3 pages long, you can answer a question, how to apply it to your life today, like right now. And that has a little journal line so you can fill it in. So I jokingly tell people, you can pay me $250 an hour for one-on-one therapy, or you can buy 17 years for $20. And I highly recommend the 17 years for $20, because you're going to get, because to me, it's a consumption issue. I was so distraught when I got hospitalized for therapy, that so many of this, I remember just having another one of those moments. Why didn't somebody tell me this? Why didn't somebody tell me that? Over and again, over again. It's like, so if I can actually capsulize a lot of this content that needs to be told over again, and then get it out to the people on a better platform, then it just opens up the doors for much more healing within the church. And so it is available as an ebook on Amazon, which reduces the practical side of having to deliver physical copies and stuff. But it was really the impetus of making that book. And the interesting thing is the second book was supposed to be on spiritual warfare, and it has never gotten off the ground. And it's been 5 years. Yeah, 4 years. Yeah. Which isn't surprising, but sadly.
Yeah. Well, maybe 2021 is the year. If nothing else, 2020 gave you lots of material to work with. So
that's true. That's true.
So what's the name of the book?
So the name of the book is called Jesus is In.
All right. So I will put that in the show notes. I'll put your YouTube channel and your website in there. Send me that that PDF or whatever that you talked about. Okay, the prayer you talked about.
Yeah.
So make sure that goes in the show notes also. So maybe close it out. Like, I hate to stop talking to you because it's so good. We're gonna have to have just a one-on-one Zoom another time. But tell me why the gospel is still relevant in light of all you experienced, right? Growing up in the church, being abused, all of that. Why is the gospel still relevant to you?
Because there is nothing else that changes the heart of man. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And the understanding of the depth of the love of God, because I am innately valuable to him, because I exist, and that he wants relationship with me, that he loves me deeply. And I do have a story that I tell about the day that God made you, which just speaks life into the reality of his thoughts towards you, based completely on scripture, and knowing that there's nothing else like it on the planet, and understanding that Jesus paid the price for all of my junk. And God showed, so another revelation God showed me, he says, I have better things to do with my day than look around at your junk that you keep trying to show me that I've already forgiven you for. So let's get on with it. Let's get on with life and all the things that I have prepared for you, and stop looking at all of your old stuff. I've forgiven it. Jesus already paid the price, and he's ready to go play. So absolutely valuable to everybody on the planet today.
Yeah, that's so good. I think that's going to be my closing question for 2021. Why is the gospel still relevant to you? Thanks so much for sharing all of this. And again, send me your credentials, because I don't know. I mean, I know you're ordained, but I don't know your licensing. Like, what are the letters that are supposed to go with your name?
all the alphabet soup.
Right, everybody has a different letter. So, but again, thanks so much for curating safe space. How awesome is that, right? It's, it looks like Jesus.
I love what I do. I love watching the women in my groups go from I can't to I'm already doing it, and watching them explode with what God has designed them for. So it's just the joy of my heart. Absolutely.
Yeah.